Good morning, welcome back. Beautiful sunny fall morning. Good to have you here. We have just 2 more weeks, so hopefully you have been enjoying and learning from the class. As many of you have done teaching before, as any teacher will tell you, the teacher is the one who's learning the most and maybe having the most fun, so hopefully you have approximated something also enjoyable and beneficial from this class. I'm already starting to think about who are the 10 people that I want to do, Lord willing, next fall, mostly in the Reformation, but in early modern history. So I'll take suggestions if you want to send them to me, and I don't have to make a decision on that for 9 more months. But thinking ahead and hope to continue this 2 more times. So 4 total courses on this. Just 2 more weeks. My wife will tell you 2 things about this. One, that I really enjoy doing this each week and preparing for it. And 2, that she's really glad when it's done because it takes up a lot of extra time. She says, "Where are you on Saturday?" That you're, well, I'm spending time with Thomas Aquinas. So she'll be glad to have a little bit more of me back. We come today to Aquinas, one of the people I think in this class that you've probably heard of and at least know a couple of facts about. There's quite a bit of discussion, controversy, and there often has been, especially as Protestants, as Reformed Christians. How should we think of Thomas Aquinas? Is he mostly a bad guy who had some good things, or is he mostly a good guy that we just need to filter out the things that we don't agree with as Protestants? Well, I'm more toward the second one than the first one, but this next hour isn't really to persuade you of any particular thing relative to Aquinas, but as I've tried to do with this class and with the one last year, I'm trying to present people in the way that is most, hopefully, accessible, but also most positive. All of these people will have disagreements, and in particular, as we look at some that are more aligned with Catholic theology and doctrine, and yet even like Richard the Lionheart, who has many flaws, and the Crusades that we don't agree with many aspects of. I've been trying to present in a way to say, hey, this is our history, and we have things to celebrate and things to learn from it. So that's what I want to do with Aquinas as well. The one exception to this rule is going to come next week when we look at Pope Boniface VIII, who is undoubtedly a bad guy. I have a book, it's got a great title that I'm reading through called Bad Popes. Well, there it is. It just tells you, and he is one of the bad popes. And as you'll learn next week, he figures prominently in Dante's Inferno because he is very much in one of the center circles of hell for Dante, along with a few other popes. We'll get to that as we move out of the 13th century into the 14th century next week. But today, we are squarely in the 13th century. You can see Aquinas, his life, short though it was, is smack dab right in the middle of the 13th century. The 13th century is often called the golden age of medieval Christianity. If you look at a typical church history textbook, they probably have a chapter titled something like that, the Golden Age. I'm not sure that everything in this century was all that golden. You still have Crusades going on, and as Protestants, there are certain theological developments that we would say were heading in the wrong direction. And yet, it's true that much of what we think about as medieval Christianity comes from the 13th century, and in many ways, there are significant accomplishments or at least themes in the 13th century that are still with us today. Let me mention 6 of those. Some of them are accomplishments, some of them are themes, 6 categories. And this will help orient us to the whole century and also orient us to Thomas Aquinas. So number 1, 6 categories to try to understand the 13th century. One is the rise of the papacy. The rise is really not the right word because the papacy has been central throughout the Middle Ages. But what I mean is, as we are in the 13th and 14th century, we come to the very height of papal claims. As you recall, since the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, there has been, we've seen one of the themes in this class, a constant tug of war between pope, bishops, and king or emperor. Who really has the final say? Who has the final authority? Here in the 13th century, we see even more daring claims of papal authority. I'll mention Innocent III. Innocent III, his papal reign from 1198 to 1216 is where you see many of these claims. So, for example, there's a famous, I can't recall if it's a letter or a sermon, where Innocent talks about the sun and the moon. And he says, just as in Genesis you have the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, so God has ordained in the firmament of his universe 2 great lights, the sun and the moon. Well, who's the sun? Clearly, it's the Pope. The lesser light is the emperor or the king. Both are important, both illumine something, but the king or the emperor, he is but a reflection of the greater light, the sun, that is the Pope. Innocent preached on Jeremiah 1:10, and we'll see this again. Pope Boniface VIII claims this same verse, Jeremiah 1:10, "See, today I have appointed you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant." And the Pope said, that's a prophecy about me. Instead of being called the vicar of Peter, he preferred to be called the vicar of Christ. And it's not that priests and bishops hadn't been called such before, but now the Pope is claiming it for himself, and perhaps for himself alone. His successor, Innocent IV, went even farther and preferred to be called the vicar of God. Innocent thought of himself like when God says to Moses, "You shall be as God to Pharaoh," he said, yeah, that's the Pope. That's how God has established. Just as Moses was like God to Pharaoh, so the Pope is like God to these pharaohs and these kings. He believed that the Roman Church was given the authority to approve and to pass on imperial dynasties. He considered himself veros imperator. You don't have to know Latin to get that. The true emperor. He considered himself a priest like Melchizedek, a kind of priest and a king who organized Christian society with the Pope at the head and at the center. So we see coming into the 12th, 13th, 14th century, the rise of the papacy in its most audacious and outlandish, we would say, claims. A second theme is an event, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the largest and most significant medieval council, over 1,000 church officials, 400 bishops, 800 abbots, and others. The council condemned various groups they considered heretical, the Albigensians and the Waldensians. The former were heretical. The latter, many reformers took to be a precursor to their movement. This council made the Inquisition obligatory on the whole church, so we're getting into the launch of the Inquisition. The council launched a new crusade. It required yearly confession in order to receive communion, and most important theologically, this is for the first time we have the approval of the language of transubstantiation relative to the Eucharist. Now, some would still say that the Catholic Church hadn't officially forbidden other ways of describing the real presence of the Eucharist, but now for the first time. And so it is important to remember, this is 1215. This is not like the 2nd century. It's 1,000 years before the church says, you know how, well, you know the rest of it. Well, you know how we should think of the real presence of Christ. It's a transubstantiation. It is the physical body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. Third, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about, I'm sorry, only half of you can see what I'm writing up here, the mendicant orders. A mendicant means someone who begs. So we've seen a lot about different monastic movements. In particular, most of Western Europe are Benedictine monks. So the Cluniacs and then the Cistercians are different families of monasteries, but they are appealing to the Benedictine rule. We need to get back to the Benedictine rule. Here in the 13th century, we have the official approval of two new religious orders. And they're mendicants because unlike the previous monasteries, these are going to make their livelihood solely by the contributions of others, by begging. Now, the monks up to this point have all had to take vows of poverty, but you recall the Cluniacs and then the Cistercians, the actual monasteries, they can own land, they can own many valuable possessions of gold and silver and chalices and the like, and in fact, they become quite wealthy. So you can go and you could look at pictures of some of these Cistercian abbeys that are still around. And boy, they look like the place you would want to go to have a retreat, or in this wild medieval world. Yes, you might want to go there. You might want to send your kids there to this place that has vineyards and lands. Well, the monks worked and they took contributions, and so many of these monasteries grew quite wealthy. This is a different idea. So not only do the individual monks have to take vows of poverty, but the order itself says we are not allowed to own anything. We're not allowed to own any vessels for the Eucharist. We're not allowed to own any land. We are going to take a vow of poverty, not just individually, but corporately. And one of the critiques by the Reformers will be these mendicant orders become just a nuisance constantly. Why don't they work for their bread and for their food, begging for others? But here we have two new orders. Probably heard of them. The Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Dominicans, founded by a Spaniard named Dominic Guzman, he lived 1170 to 1221, were approved as a new monastic order in 1216. The Pope gives official recognition. The Franciscans, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, 1182 to 1226, received their approval in 1223. So these are new orders at the beginning of the 13th century. The two orders reflected the differences between their founders. Dominic sought to emulate the apostles and preachers, the apostles as preachers and students of the word. So the Dominicans were called Ordo Fratrum Predicatorum, or the Order of Preaching Brothers. The Dominicans, even today, you may see behind somebody's name this OP, sorry, not Orthodox Presbyterian, but OP, the Order of Preaching Brothers. Those are the Dominicans. If you see OFM, those are the Franciscans, which stands for the Ordo Fratrum Minorum. That is the Order of Little Brothers, or Friars Minor. So the Dominicans would go on to be famous theologians. They would often be engaged in mission work, and the Pope would give to the Dominicans most of the responsibility of the Inquisition. So the Dominicans said we're an order of preachers, students, theologians. Francis, by contrast, was drawn to the common people, to nature, to a simple and joyful faith. So the Franciscans were still preachers. Francis did a lot of preaching. You ever hear the saying attributed to St. Francis? Preach the gospel always, use words if necessary. Wow, what a great thing, except Francis never said it, didn't live like it, and it totally denies everything he stood for. Other than that, it's a great saying. Go ahead and repeat it. So Francis was a preacher, these were preachers, and yet they were not students in the way that the Dominicans were. There was a saying that perhaps a medieval saying that summarizes these different monastic tributaries. Quote, Bernard loved the valleys, Benedict the mountains, Francis the towns, Dominic the populous cities. There was a story told, and it's almost certainly apocryphal, but we can wish that it weren't, to illustrate the difference between Dominic and Francis, that one time Dominic was studying, and there was a sparrow alighting outside of his window, just humming around. And he was interrupted in his study, and so he grabbed the sparrow and plucked it and threw it to the ground. Whereas the story told, if it were Francis, what would he have done? Well, he would have never harmed the sparrow. He probably would have started speaking to the sparrow. He would have brought the sparrow in and given it a nest among them. So Dominic was given to study. Francis, these are stereotypes, to nature and a simple faith. They founded these two orders, and we'll see in a moment how they connect with Aquinas. All right, 3 more themes quickly here. Number 4, you say something about the literature of the 13th century. We'll come next week to what is the singular literary achievement of the Middle Ages, which is Dante's Divine Comedy, where he travels Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. That is the picture of the Middle Ages and is the great literary achievement defining and representing the Middle Ages. One other important piece of literature to mention in this century, so Dante's Divine Comedy is set in 1300, even though it's not finished until maybe 1321. Another piece to mention is, it goes by different names, but scholars call it the Lancelot Grail cycles. So the King Arthur legends. Now those have been around for 100 years or more, but here they come out in a series of 5 works about King Arthur and the legends with Sir Lancelot and Sir Galahad and Excalibur. These come out in the first half of the 13th century. And it's very interesting to think about what this represents in medieval culture. I may write a blog post about this. There's a famous historian, he died several decades ago, named Christopher Dawson, who has a famous book called Religion and the Rise of Western Culture, based on some lectures he gave in the 1940s. And one of Dawson's overarching themes and arguments in the book, and I think there's something to it, you don't have to be entirely convinced, but that he argues the rise of Western European culture in the Middle Ages was the fusion and tension of 2 cultures. The warrior society of the barbarian kingdoms that needed to be conquered, and then the Christianity that conquered those kingdoms. So he says you have the society of the warrior aggressive ethos, and then you have the Christian ideals of worldly renunciation, prayer, study, salvation in the life to come. So one represented by the warring kings and armies, and the other by the monks and the monasteries. And so he says what is unique in Christendom is that these 2 come together in a complementary, there's always a tension, but in a complementary way in medieval culture. And he says we see it come in its fullest flower in the Crusades. You have military orders, like Bernard started with the Knights Templar. These are actually fighting monks. They're soldiers and they're monks. That's the coming together in a formal way of these 2 societies. The warriors of the barbarian kingdoms, that kind of ethos, and then the pious, worldly, renouncing, sacrificing. So this is where you get the medieval ethic of chivalry. So brave, courage, but you give up of yourself and your rights. And this is what we have in these Lancelot and Grail stories. If you need to be reminded what it's like, Monty Python did a perfect version of what these stories were like, or Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That's basically just 2 history documentaries. But you know enough of the story that it's the fusion of these 2 ideals. Noble knights on a valiant quest, but it's a religious quest. It's to find the Grail, and you treat women with the utmost respect and dignity. So Dawson says, quote, "Each of the great world civilizations has been faced with the problem of reconciling the aggressive ethos of the warrior with the moral ideals of a universal religion. But in none of them has the tension been so vital and so intense as in medieval Christendom. And nowhere have the results been more important for the history of culture." So just a big macro idea, something to think about. He argues medieval culture and Christendom was the fusion of these 2, the warrior ethos leavened by Christian ideals. 5, I promise we are getting to Aquinas. Architecture. We haven't said very much in this class about the material history of the Middle Ages. What were farms like? What were homes like? What was technology like? What were churches like? But here, at least a paragraph to say that it's in the 12th and the 13th century, we see a transition from what's called Romanesque architecture to Gothic architecture. Now, for most of us, myself included, until I started looking at this, to the untrained eye, we might not be able to tell the difference if you're going through Europe and you just see, wow, old stone, cool-looking church. You wouldn't know Romanesque, but Romanesque, meaning the ideas are from the Roman era, and that has a certain look to it. And the churches and cathedrals were often very fortress-like. Part of that was maybe a mentality of we're under siege, we're under attack, but it also had to do with the technology of the day. You needed very thick walls if you were going to build anything high. And so there's lots of walls, thick walls. Here in the 12th and 13th century, we transition to Gothic. Like a lot of terms, this started out as an insult, like Puritans was an insult, fundamentalists was an insult. Gothic, the term comes from the Italian Renaissance a few centuries later, because there in the Renaissance, what does the Renaissance want to do? They want to rediscover the civilization of the Greeks and the Romans. So all these things that weren't Greco-Roman, the Italians called in the manner of the Goths. It was barbaric. That's what the Goths were. They were the barbarian tribes, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, all the rest. But it has come to describe not only this time period, but a certain style of church building. The key difference is the Gothic churches had fewer walls and thinner walls. Now, they were still very thick by our standards, but instead of thick masonry walls, they had more open spaces, less fortress-like. They had pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and your most famous, fun architectural term, they had many flying buttresses. Flying buttresses is what you see outside of a church, a kind of arch device that supports the wall. So because that supported the weight of the walls, they were able to be thinner, and that's why the walls in Gothic churches were able to have windows. So much more light coming in. This is where you have the advent of stained glass and elaborate rose windows, or windows that depict Bible stories or other things in history. These are Gothic churches. Think of Abbey Church at Saint Denis in France. That's often considered the first. Notre Dame in Paris, other churches in Reims, Chartres, Amiens, the Strasbourg Minster, Freiburg Cathedral in Germany, cathedrals in England and Canterbury, Lincoln, Salisbury. York Minster, that's a little bit later, but all examples of Gothic architecture. And then finally, it's in this century that we have the rise of universities. Recall, education was for many, many centuries almost exclusively the province of the monasteries. If you wanted education, you would send your kids to a monastery or you would join a monastery. Then prominent cathedrals, so think of leading churches and leading towns, cathedrals, there would be schools attached to the cathedrals. Well, by the beginning of the 13th century, now universities are beginning to flourish. They're established as a legal corporation, as a gathering of teachers and students. Initially, often you would literally be gathering on a straw floor in a barn, just a teacher and some students. You didn't have all the impressive buildings. You didn't even have sports teams. How could you have a university without that? No fancy cafeteria. A university. Bologna, Oxford, Paris. These would be some of the first and most important. The universities would become a major source of spreading, defending, developing Christian culture. In fact, you could argue that really this is the first institutional invention in medieval Christendom since the monasteries. Now, there's lots of other things happening, of course, but the universities are this new institutional thing that is going to play such a large role in disseminating the ideas and giving a place for the people. So now it's not just the monasteries. Up to this point, almost everyone we've studied, except for kings or crusaders, they're monks, and Thomas Aquinas is too. But Thomas Aquinas is going to be associated with the beginnings of these universities, not just some abbey somewhere. All of these 6 items I mention not only because they introduce us to the 13th century, but because each of them in different ways introduce us to Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born in Italy in 1225. He died in 1274. He was a Dominican friar, so we looked at the Dominicans, and a priest. He was a philosopher, a biblical exegete, and the foremost scholastic theologian of his age, and arguably belongs on the Mount Rushmore of the most important theologians of all of church history. He's going to be on everyone's short list. Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm's on some people's list, Luther, Calvin. So if you got to come up with 4 or 5 of the most consequential theologians in the history of the church, Aquinas is on it. Thomas came from the Aquino family in Italy. He was one of, good number here, 9 children. He was the 8th of 9 children, born to wealthy aristocrats, so there's where the comparisons stop. But he was born at the family castle. We do have a fairly nice house. I don't know if it's quite a castle, but in a town called Rocca between Rome and Naples. Around the age of 5, he was taken to live at Monte Cassino. Maybe if you got a really good memory, that sounds familiar because that's the famous mountain home where Benedict first started his monastic community. So he is going to the mothership of Benedictine monasticism on Monte Cassino. He was a child, it's called an oblate, which simply means you're one who hasn't made, you're not a professio. That is, you're not someone who has made a vow to join a monastic community. You're an oblate. You're there simply to study. Now, it may sound sort of strange to us, heartless, that you send your 5-year-old off, but it's a boarding school, and it was fairly common, especially among well-to-do families. Around the age of 15, Thomas entered the Studium Generale, so kind of like a university. It's called the Studium, for study, Generale, because it would welcome people from anywhere as opposed to a school that was only for your particular town or region. So for all intents and purposes, he enters the new university at Naples, where he was to study liberal arts and philosophy. As a student of the liberal arts, Thomas's studies would have focused on the trivium. Some of you did this, or you have your kids in classical school, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and then the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music. So at Naples, so he goes there when he's 15 years old. At Naples, he is introduced to two new ideas in the world that would forever change Thomas, and because of that, you could say they really changed the world. One, he was introduced to the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle, 385 to 320 BC, famous Greek philosopher. In the 6th century AD, there was a Christian philosopher named Boethius who had plans to translate Aristotle. So Aristotle, of course, would have written in Greek. By this point, once the East and the West get more culturally separated in the, say, 5th century AD, most of Western Europe doesn't have a good grasp of Greek. People don't know Greek, they don't have Greek grammar, they don't have Greek textbooks. So the whole sort of, if it's all Greek to me, it's sort of lost. So Boethius had a plan to translate Aristotle into Latin. He translated his logic textbook, and that's as far as he got because he ran afoul of the emperor and the emperor put him to death. A big what if. But it meant that no one in the West had first-hand knowledge of Aristotle's works on natural science, on metaphysics, on ethics, and this all began to change in the 12th century. The works by Aristotle and some of the Arabic philosophers who are now commenting on Aristotle, they begin to be translated into Latin. And this intellectual retrieval is happening in earnest in the 13th century. This rediscovery of Aristotle was nothing short of revolutionary, and it was also controversial. So who would have been the dominant philosophical mind in the West prior to Aristotle? It was Plato. Plato had reigned supreme. So when Aristotle comes, who has many significant differences with Plato and how they understand metaphysics and ideas and form and matter and things we don't have to get into here, but Aristotle was banned at many universities, including Paris. But he was not banned at Naples. And so Thomas was introduced to Aristotle. He was likely introduced to the Arabic philosopher Averroes, who's from in the 12th century, and then also the Jewish philosopher from the 12th century, Maimonides. So Aquinas is getting this very cutting-edge education. Aristotle, rediscovered in the West, Averroes, Maimonides, Arabic interpreter, Jewish interpreter, and we'll come back to Aristotle in just a moment. So that's one thing he becomes acquainted with at Naples. The second we've already alluded to, and that's the Dominicans. The Dominicans, remember, they're not approved until, 1216? So this is just less than a decade before Thomas was born. This is a very new religious kid on the block. Thomas was inspired by their commitment to prayer, their study in the service of preaching and defending the faith. So around 1244, Thomas joins the Dominicans. His family was not happy. You say, well, why weren't they happy? He's joining this new religion. Well, yes, but he comes from old money. They were a minor nobility, but the nobility, enough that he had a castle, and he had knights in his family. So what do you want your son of a noble family to do? What are your upwardly mobile options? Well, really, it's the church, or that's about it. And so what they wanted is good. You're at Monte Cassino. You are at St. Benedict's famous monastery. Maybe you'll become a monk, or a prior, that's like a teacher at the monastery, or you'll rise to the rank of an abbot, or maybe you'll become a priest and then a bishop. This is what so to join the Dominicans, what? It's like, you got Harvard, and then you decide to go to, I won't insult some other school, but I kind of like what's called Harvard actually now. But why are you joining the Dominicans? So they're so unhappy that in his travels, his family kidnaps him, puts him under house arrest. Now, it was a castle, so it was okay, but they wouldn't let him leave his home for a year. They're trying to convince him, no, you cannot be a Dominican. The story is told, again, it's one of those, if it's not true, I kind of hope that it is, but the story is told his brothers were so desperate to turn him away from this path of being a Dominican that they smuggled a prostitute into his room. Would you just hook up with the prostitute would be better than being a Dominican. But the story is told that he grabbed some coals from his fire and a burning stick, and he shooed the prostitute. She was probably, what am I doing here? She's probably glad to leave. And he didn't have sex with the prostitute. So after a year, his family relents, and they let him go. So it's important to remember Thomas, who now, especially as Catholics, if you think of what is traditional theology, well, it's Thomas. But it's important to remember he is hitching his wagon to two very new controversial things. One, the philosophy of Aristotle, and two, the Dominican order. So he would have been thought going in a very non-traditional direction. After release by his family, he goes back to Naples. Then it seems the Dominicans send him to Paris, then to Cologne. He's ordained as a priest in 1250 or 1251. So he becomes a priest. And then in both places, he studies with the Dominican theologian. Okay, I want to look at our friend back there, Albert the Great. There he is, Albert, thank you. Albert the Great. And it's while studying with Albert that Thomas received his famous nickname. Maybe you've heard of it. Of all the nicknames that have been given to people in the history of the world, this is perhaps the least fitting nickname. Maybe you want to help your kids. If they got a nickname they don't like, they don't have to own the nickname, because Thomas was called by his fellow students the dumb ox. Didn't quite prove to be true. Why? He was tall, he was stout, and he was quiet. So they thought he was a dumb ox. Proved not to be the case, of course. In 1251 or 52, Thomas goes to Paris to further his studies and to become a lecturer on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Chad Van Dixhoorn talked about Lombard last week. The sentences, that book or those series of books were a compilation of quotations from the Bible and from church fathers. It was the medieval theology textbook. Everyone who studied theology studied Lombard's sentences, and Aquinas would write a commentary on Lombard's sentences. In the spring of 1256, Thomas became, quote, a master of the sacred page. His job was threefold: to lecture and to comment on Scripture, to participate in disputations, and to preach. After working as this magister, master of the sacred page, in Paris, 1256 to 59, he then returned to Italy, where his job from 1259 to 1268 involved teaching other Dominicans. In 1268, he returns to Paris, so he's back and forth, Paris and usually Naples, and 1272, again sent back to Naples to set up a new studium, a new college centered around his teaching. On December 6, 1273, some of you may recognize December 6 is celebrated in some traditions as the feast day for St. Nicholas. December 6, 1273, Thomas had some kind of mystical experience. Now, some people interpret he had a stroke or he had a nervous breakdown. Others say, well, it was clearly in the realm of some kind of spiritual vision or epiphany. But Thomas, who was a workaholic, we would say, absolutely committed to his studies, has this experience during Mass on December 6th, and he returns to his room, and his friend, Reginald, who is kind of like you might say, a research assistant, Reginald tries to get him, Thomas, what's going on? You're not working. Don't you want to get back to work? And Thomas famously replies, quote, "All that I have written seems to me like straw compared to what has been revealed to me." I don't know exactly what that was, but it seems like Thomas had some kind of vision, experience, existential moment of such profound spiritual gravity that he said, all that I've written are just words, straw. They can't compare to what I've seen or felt or experienced. And so, December 6th, he stops writing. Now, as a hard providence would have it, he didn't live very much longer. A few months later, he was summoned to attend the Council of Lyon, and while traveling to the council, it's just amazing how, all that he did in such a short span of life. He's traveling to a council on horse, and he hits his head on a tree branch, and he never recovers. He asks to be brought to a nearby Cistercian monastery at Fossa Nova, and there on March 7, 1274, he dies of injuries from being hit in the head with a tree branch riding on his horse. Not yet 50 years old. Aquinas was undoubtedly the greatest European thinker of the 13th century, and perhaps the greatest of all medieval thinkers. The assessment of Thomas and his ideas are called Thomism, just one of those things that maybe it was too hard to say Aquinasism or something, it just becomes Thomism. So you hear him referred to as Aquinas or just Thomas. In 1277, his ideas were actually condemned by the church in Paris and Oxford. So in his day, people knew he was brilliant, but his ideas were condemned. But by 1323, he was canonized by the Pope. In 1567, he was declared a doctor of the church. In 1879, the study of Thomas was enjoined on all Catholic students of theology. And in 1880, he was made the patron saint of all Catholic universities. The church has always paid attention to Thomas, but his reputation, especially outside the church, has waxed and waned. Not surprisingly, it was from the time of the Enlightenment, maybe René Descartes onward, that Thomas was not considered much of a philosopher to be reckoned with, and that's changed quite a bit in the last 75 years, and now even secular scholars will pay more attention to him. In the middle of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, famous atheist or agnostic philosopher, critiqued Aquinas, saying Aquinas wasn't a real philosopher because he wasn't willing to search and find the truth wherever it would lead him, but he already knew the truth, the Catholic faith, and he simply did his philosophizing to support that truth. Now, Bertrand Russell meant that as an insult, but I think he maybe got Aquinas right. That Aquinas wasn't the type of philosopher who just said, I'm going to just go wherever this truth leads me, but he had a faith which he embraced, and then he did his philosophy to try to support that faith, as we'll see in just a moment. He was undoubtedly brilliant. It was said he could dictate different works using various secretaries at the same time. His energy and his efforts were, until this moment in 1273, absolutely indefatigable. Some men are born for action, some for revolution, some for artistic achievement, some for acts of compassion. Thomas, it seems, was born to read and to write. It's said that his friends had to remind him to eat during the day because he was so bent on his studies. He wrote and wrote. He wrote a commentary on Lombard sentences, commentaries on Scripture, commentaries on almost everything Aristotle wrote. He wrote commentaries on other theologians and philosophers. He wrote on individual subjects pertaining to theology and philosophy, and most famously, he wrote 2 massive works. These are the titles we give to them, not the title Thomas gave to them, but one is the Summa Contra Gentiles, the summary of arguments against the pagans. So you might think of it as a kind of apologetic work. 800 pages, Summa Contra Gentiles, written between 1259 and 1265. And then, of course, the Summa Theologica, written between 1265 and 1274. He never finished it. You say, what else did you have to say? The Summa Theologica, so here's volume 1. So this is about 600 pages. It's not very big print, double column print. And this is volume 1 of 5 volumes. I didn't want to haul down all 5 volumes from my office. I've read a bunch of it. I haven't read every word of it. The Summa Theologica with St. Thomas Aquinas. If you want one book and you say, I want to know more about the Summa Theologica, which I don't anticipate everyone does, this is a fantastic book published by Baker, about 400 pages. This is the essential Summa Theologiae, a reader and commentary. So this gives a helpful introduction, some of which I've just given you here, and then it distills into about 400 pages what is 3,000 pages, and helpfully he provides very accessible footnotes to explain. So this is, the Reader's Digest version, as much as you could, of Aquinas. Also, here's a typical one that many scholars use by Brian Davies, Aquinas, an introduction. It's a bit heady at times, but it's a good introduction of Aquinas' thought. And if you wanted to read something smaller, doesn't this look like the sort of book you buy in your college bookstore? Come on, we can do better than this. But Aquinas, the Cardinal Virtues. So this is 150 pages, and this is just a section pulled from the Summa Theologica. If you wanted to read not his metaphysics, but just his ethics, where he talks about the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. What shall we say about the Summa? It's structured in 3 parts. First part concerns God and creation. Second part, human action, which has 2 halves, a theoretical part and then a detailed examination of virtues and vices, of which this is a part. And then the third part concerns Christ, his work, his person, the church, the sacraments, the consummation of all things. There are parts, questions, and articles. So if you're reading or you see someone, they'll maybe say 1, 4, 6. Part 1, and what did I just say? Question for Article 6. That's how the Summa is usually referenced. His approach was modeled on the university disputation system. So in a disputation, you would have a statement, a thesis, and then some students would argue against that thesis, and then the master, the teacher, perhaps the next day, he would come, after they argued for and against, he would come and give his opinion and his response. This is how the Summa works. So each article here follows the same very orderly 5-step pattern. So first, there's a statement, a thesis statement in the form of a question. Then he raises objections. Then he offers a counterposition, which is often just maybe one sentence. And usually that counterposition is going to be Aquinas' position, but not always. So you got thesis statement, objections, counterposition, Then Aquinas says, here's what I say. So fourth, his answer. And then the fifth section are his replies to the earlier objections. So audience participation, pick a page number. Let's see how Aquinas does this. Pick a page number somewhere between 1 and 550. Let's just see what Aquinas talks about here. Give me a number. What?
20.
What 20? 220. All right. Okay, well, this is on question 43 in part 1, the mission of the divine persons. Now, don't think missionary. Mission means the sending of the divine persons. So, second article, whether mission is eternal or temporal. Whether mission, the sending of the divine persons, the Son and the Spirit, is eternal or temporal. So, that's the thesis. Objection 1, it would seem that mission can be eternal. Objection 2, objection 3, and then on the contrary, it is said, when in the fullness of time was come, God sent his Son. So, mission is eternal, gives objection. Then he says, but here's the other position. I answer that a certain difference is to be observed in all the words that express the origin of the divine persons. Reply, objection, reply, objection, reply, objection. So it is a masterpiece of order, precision, concision, and yes, many parts you will say, I never knew anybody ask that question. I don't know why we would ask that question. But what he is doing in the Summa, he is summarizing. There are no rhetorical flourishes, no flights of passion. He doesn't write with the kind of brilliance of Augustine or later like a Calvin. But it's a feat of order, clarity, and comprehensiveness. He says at the beginning that he has written the Summa, quote, to enlightened beginners. Oh, beginners. And lots of people have speculated, what does he mean? Well, he probably doesn't mean, a new Christian. He means beginners in the Dominican order. That this is probably these are, his lectures that he taught over many years to Dominicans. So, the closest analogy might be he wrote this for seminary students. He wrote it for people who were studying for formal church ministry or academic life. It's impossible to summarize the Summa or even mention some highlights in 8 or 10 minutes remaining. Let me just give you a few hooks. Number 1, and maybe most importantly, what Aquinas says is for the most part unoriginal. That is, he's summarizing a whole host of orthodox classic doctrines, from the Trinity to Christology to the nature of God and his attributes. That's why the Reformers, especially the second generation, third generation Reformers, so often started with Aquinas or looked to Aquinas. They thought him a trustworthy guide on these big issues of doctrine of God, person of Christ. Second, Aquinas is significant because of the scholastic method. Scholasticism is less a particular content and more a method of terms, of distinctions, of logic. So, for example, Aquinas learns from Aristotle the 4 kinds of causes: efficient cause, formal cause, material cause, final cause. If you read any of the Reformers, they use these 4 causes in talking about justification. What is the efficient cause of our justification? The formal, the material, the final. So these ideas and categories from Aristotle, Aquinas uses, and later Protestants will use them as well. The Reformers at times rejected scholasticism as it was practiced by some of the universities in Paris, for example, but they adopted many of the terms, many of the methods. And so there's a whole period called, in the 16th and 17th century, of Lutheran scholasticism or Reformed scholasticism that uses these same kind of distinctions that we find here in Aquinas. Third hook, Revelation and reason. This is where Aquinas is most famous, or depending on your perspective, most infamous. He did not baptize Aristotle or make a syncretistic religion of Christianity in Aristotle any more than Augustine and most of the Western tradition up to this point baptized Plato. So sometimes you think, well, boy, Aquinas just went all in with Aristotle and created this syncretism of Christianity and Aristotle. Well, it is true. You have to read with a lens to say, is this owing to Aristotle more than to the Bible? It's good. But it's not as if everyone before Aquinas just had some tabula rasa. They were all writing with Platonic ideas. And sometimes that was helpful, and sometimes it led earlier theologians astray who would tend to have, for example, a more negative view of the body because of certain Platonic forms and ideas and notions. He critiqued Aristotle when necessary. He thought of reason not as the starting point for building up the faith. He was not an Enlightenment rationalist, but rather to provide support and defense of the faith. We don't have time to go into his 5 proofs. If you learned anything about Aquinas in a philosophy class or Western Civ class, you probably learned about his 5 proofs for the existence of God, all of which are kind of the same idea, some kind of, well, if there's an effect, there must be a cause. If there's a movement, there must be a first mover. If there's action, there must be someone who is unmoved in his pure actuality. He's so active. So they all are of the same kind of ideas. But he never laid out those proofs to say, I'm going to put, Scripture behind my back, and just with my brain, I'm going to build up Christianity. He begins the Summa by distinguishing between, quote, the philosophical sciences discovered by human reason and the sacred science which comes by way of revelation. He says the sacred science, what we get from the Bible, can draw upon the philosophical sciences, quote, not as though it stood in need of them, but only in order to make its teaching clearer. For it accepts its principles not from the other sciences, but immediately from God by revelation. So he says, we have sacred theology by God's revelation, and then this philosophy can help to support it. So when Aquinas talks about his 5 ways, he calls them, for God's existence, he actually starts with Exodus 3:14, I am who I am. So he says, we know from Revelation God exists. I'm not questioning that God exists. But how might we show to skeptics, or how might we support our own faith in these 5 ways? And it's amazing that out of 3,000 pages, the 5 ways are about a page and a half. And for many people, you would have thought a whole volume of Aquinas was on proving God's existence. It was a very small part of what he did. Now, here's a key difference. Do you remember from Anselm? I'm speaking in broad brush, but helps us understand. Anselm's proof for God's existence, remember the ontological argument there is a being greater than which nothing can be conceived? That's a very Platonic, a very Plato-influenced way of thinking. You're thinking about the realm of ideas. Whereas Aquinas, you can see the Aristotle influence. He's dealing with observation, with perception, what we can see. Look, Anselm probably would have said, well, we can't be absolutely certain that maybe our sense perception's deceiving ourselves. And maybe Aristotle, not rejecting Anselm, would have said, well, that's the life of the mind. But look at what we can see. We can see there's cause and effect. We can see that there must be some unmoved mover. He starts in a very Aristotelian way with this observable reality. He believed philosophy and reason were there to defend the faith. He says, quote, human reason cannot prove what is held on to by faith. Nevertheless, holy teaching makes use of human reason. Not, of course, to prove faith, since this would take away the merit of faith, but to make clear other things that are handed on in this teaching. And then here's maybe one of the most famous sentences of Aquinas. Since, therefore, Grace does not take away nature, but perfects it. This is at the very beginning of the Summa. Grace does not take away nature, but perfects it. That, many theologians have taken to be a central thesis in Aquinas' theology. That when God gives us grace, he doesn't eradicate human nature. He doesn't work, he doesn't have to blow us up as human beings, but he perfects it. So there's something there to work with, Aquinas might say. So you have desires, Aquinas would say, for food, sex, meaning, purpose. God's grace doesn't say, bad, I obliterate those desires. Grace perfects those desires, which you have by nature. That's Aquinas' ways of thinking, which opens up for Aquinas the possibility of natural theology, natural law. One other thing, and then we'll close, and just one other hook, and that's proved important, and that's, 3 minutes? That's how Aquinas speaks about speaking of God. And Reformed theologians later would almost root and branch would crib what Aquinas says about this. So Aquinas says, how can we, God is infinite, ineffable, beyond us. How do we talk about God? Do our words about God really, do they mean the same thing when we talk about God as when we talk about other things? So if I say this pizza is good, and then I say God is good. Now, does good mean the same thing? So Aquinas said that there are three ways to think about it. One, univocal or univocal, depending on the emphasis on which syllable, meaning one. So our words about God and our words about other things are the same. Second, he says, is equivocal. So they're different. So if I say, row your boat to the north bank, row your boat to the south bank. The word bank there is used in a univocal sense. The word bank means the same thing in both sentences. But if I say, row your boat to the north bank, and then go up the hill and deposit your money in the bank, oh, that's equivocal. The word bank there does not mean the same thing. We understand that in English. Well, Aquinas rejects both of these, and he says the way we talk about God is analogical. So, quote, this way of sharing meanings lies between pure equivocation and simple univocity. For in analogies, the meaning is neither identical, as it is in univocals, nor totally different, as in equivocals. Rather, a term that is said in multiple ways signifies various proportions to some one thing. So he famously argues our talk about God is by way of analogy. So if you say God is good and pizza is good, good isn't used in the exact same way, but by analogy, it can't be totally equivocal, or why are we even saying anything about God? And then, I find this somewhat humorous, here's Aquinas' great example of analogical thinking. Quote, thus, healthy applied to urine signifies the sign of an animal's health, and applied to medicine, it signifies the cause of that same health. What? So, Aquinas says, if you want to understand this very important metaphysical concept, think of urine somehow. But we get your point, and this is how Turretin, others, for example, would make this same distinction. Analogical is how we speak about God. Well, let's bring this to a close. I said at the very beginning, I mentioned 6 big ideas from the 13th century, and I said they help us not only understand the century, but Aquinas, the most important man in the century. And if you think of those concepts, most of them make sense. So the rise of the papacy, yes, everything Thomas did as a Catholic Christian is respecting, defending under the auspices of the papacy. Literature, well, the Summa is maybe the most enduring piece of writing from the whole century. The Theology of the Fourth Lateran Council. Yes, Aquinas did much to defend this doctrine of transubstantiation, which we would disagree with. Mendicant orders. He belonged to one of these new mendicant orders. So university, Thomas's whole life was bound up in this burgeoning new university system. So you might say, well, what about the sixth? So those are 5 of the big themes. What about remember the sixth? The Gothic cathedrals. Well, many authors have made the point, and I agree with them, that though Thomas wasn't an architect, of course, or a builder, or an engineer, or a tank engine for that matter, many have pointed out rightly that Thomas's thought is a kind of intellectual Gothic cathedral. And that maybe the two go together as both are massive feats of intelligence, design, engineering, order, logic, beauty. Both are towering, sturdy, enduring accomplishments. Both bring us to another time and place. You go to the Gothic cathedral and you think, how did they do this? You go to Aquinas, you think, how did anyone write this? And yet they also remind us of 2 enduring truths. One, the possibility of great human achievement, and more importantly, the glory of God as worthy of all of our time, energy, efforts, and learning. I think as an earlier man, I was looking back at some lectures I gave 15 years ago, and I had a little paragraph about the cathedrals, and I was more negative, like what a waste of life and money and energy and vanity, and all of that happened with the cathedrals. But now I would say it spoke to the reality of medieval Christendom that all these towns, yes, they would compete with one another. Yes, there was vanity. Yes, it cost a lot of money. But they thought, who is most worthy of, if it takes 100 years to build something that towers up to heaven, we do it for the glory of God. And in the same way, though we disagree with Aquinas in many ways, he considered it his life's work to build not with mortar and stone, but with words, these great feats of towering achievement. All right, next week, a very bad pope. You won't want to miss it.